Dead Space came out 15 years ago in 2008. It's considered by most people to be considered one of the most influential survival horror games of all time. It went on to spawn multiple sequels, spin-offs, comics, books, and even an upcoming remake here later this month. I've not been very much into the horror genre most of my life. For me, it's that the media doesn't scare me as much as it should outside of jump scares and things like that. But it wasn't until recently, a couple years ago, that my friend Jimmy said, games don't have to be scary to be good if they're horror games. They just need to have some gore and make you feel a little bit uncomfortable sometimes. And so that really changed my perspective on things. So now, 15 years after the release of Dead Space, I am righting a gigantic wrong in my past and a huge blind spot in my gaming history. I played Dead Space for the first time.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry about everything.
Now, this isn't an official review or anything, but I still want to let you guys know what system I played the game on and things like that. I played Dead Space on PC. I got it through the EA Play app via Game Pass Ultimate. So, didn't have to pay for this one, but it's funny enough, I think I have an Xbox 360 copy in the room right next to me. The game took me about 9.5 hours, and I did play on easy. Normally, on my first playthrough of a game, I'll play through on at least the normal mode, if not harder. But for a game that is this old, I kind of just wanted to play it, have the experience, get the story, and understand the series better. So for those who aren't familiar, Dead Space starts out with Isaac Clarke. He's an engineer. He's headed out to the USG Ishimura. It is a planet cracker, and it's been through the ringer, I guess you could say. His crews on the USG Kellyan consist of Kendra and Sergeant Hammond. I'm sure there's some others that we don't see, but it doesn't matter because pretty soon the Kellyan is gone. They head out on the USG Kellyan out to the Ishimura, which is a planet cracker out near Aegis 7, and Isaac, Kendra, Sergeant Hammond all head off to make sure that the comm system is okay. And Isaac, of course, has an ulterior motive to make sure that his girlfriend Nicole, who's on board the Ishimura, is okay. Now, I'll start off by saying that the PC version is a little bit notorious for being buggy. There's some issues with frame rates and controller and everything else. So I did start out playing the game on PC with keyboard. I very quickly switched over to the controller after having a lot of issues. Had to go in to the settings and to the NVIDIA control panel, make some things work that shouldn't have worked. I didn't figure this out on my own. I followed guides on Steam from years and years ago, but eventually we got it working, but I still decided to play with the controller. One of the very first things I noticed about this game is the movement is not quite there. And I'm trying to realize that, yes, this game came out in 2008. Things are a little slower, things are a little clunkier. They don't move quite as fluidly as we see now. But if you think about some of the other games that came out in 2008, it really doesn't feel too badly. We tend to forget now that it's been so long, but we had games like Far Cry 2 and Fallout 3. We had Devil May Cry 4. None of these games felt bad at the time, and I imagine that Dead Space, considering how it plays and looks, felt even a little bit better. So I'll give it a pass for the slightly clunky and slow-moving character, just because of the era that it was in. You don't make it very long before your ship is blown up, out of commission, nobody's getting back on that baby, and the necromorphs are attacking. Now, the necromorphs are like a mutated human. They're a monster. They're a space monster. Let's just call it what it is. There's 1,000, every video game in space has space monsters. But Dead Space's necromorphs are really something special. The entire goal here is to figure out what's going on, get the comm system back online, make sure that everybody's okay, and get the hell out of there. One of the things about Dead Space that I noticed pretty much right off the bat that I'd forgotten about from that era and games of previous generations at all is the copious amount of save stations. Now we can just run through the world. We get a little symbol that spins on the bottom of the screen and tells us that the game is saving. 2008, we didn't have that, at least not in most games. 2008, we would have to run up to a console in the middle of the room that just totally breaks your immersion, which, hey, it's fine. It's the time period. Totally breaks your immersion and says, save. So, save stations are everywhere. And pretty much if you are running through an area in Dead Space and you see a save station, go ahead and save. Only takes a few seconds, doesn't hurt anything. Why not just go ahead and save? Let's talk about the necromorphs a little bit more for a second, because you pretty much see them in the opening 5 or so minutes of the game. They come out of the ceiling, they come out of the floors, they come out of the walls, they just appear out of nowhere. And these things are varying in size and shape, and they are incredibly deadly. Pretty much all of Isaac's weapons, except for one blaster rifle that he finds laying on the ground, are mining tools. They're engineering tools. They're repair tools. They're meant to fit in with the environment. And maybe there's a couple little stretches here and there, but for the most part, the mining weapons just totally and completely obliterate the necromorphs. The necromorphs are interesting though, because you can't just shoot them in the head. You've got to rip off their body parts. And there's nothing anybody loves more than ripping off alien body parts. Now, those body parts don't just disappear, go away, they pile up on the floor, as do the corpses of the necromorphs. This may have just been an issue with the PC problems I was having earlier, but oftentimes I would find these body parts that I would shoot off of the necromorphs just floating around in midair, or just flying through the air and making all sorts of crazy sounds, getting stuck in the walls. I do think that was probably just a problem with the aforementioned frame rate and PC problems I was having, but it wasn't really a problem. It just made it hilarious, quite frankly. The next thing I noticed, or didn't notice as the case may be, is the HUD, the heads-up display. Most games, you'll have your ammo on your top left and your health on the top right, and on the bottom right you can see if you have a throwable or something like that. And in Dead Space, you don't have any of that. And I know this has been iterated on since then, and it probably existed in some form before. But the way that Glenn Schofield, the game's director, made it so that you never really had to see any of that stuff on the screen, but you still knew all the information you needed to have, was amazing. Going back in time, this doesn't seem as relevant, but in the moment, I can imagine that starting up the game, seeing your character's health bar and oxygen meter right on the back of the character, rather than having to look on the screen or click into a pause menu or sort through your inventory or something like that, just being able to look and see it at a moment's notice, know if you're in the red, etc., without also cluttering up the rest of your screen. What a great idea. What a fantastic innovation to think about decluttering. We're talking a lot about that now. We've got games like Elden Ring that people are saying, there's no clutter on the screen. That's why I love it. And granted, that's an open world game, and this is a fairly linear space horror, but the concept remains the same, that Glenn Schofield 15 years ago in Dead Space made a minimal HUD, or really no HUD almost at all, and we're still striving to get to that point. One of the other things I wanted to bring up while I was on the subject of the HUD is how well the game integrates the audio logs into just playing the game. In many games, you pick up an audio log, you've got to stand there, you've got to go into a menu, you've got to tell it you want it to play. But in Dead Space, you pick up the audio log, it just starts playing. That's it. It's just there. There are other games, of course, that have done this before and since, but Dead Space does a really nice job of, if there's an audio log, it's just going to play it automatically for you. You'll hear it as you're walking around. If there's a text log or a video or something like that, of course, you're going to stop to have to read that. But the really fascinating part about all the different types of logs that you pick up is that the gameplay doesn't stop. Enemies can still attack you if you are looking at a note in your inventory or something along those lines. As a matter of fact, you can be at a store in the game, upgrading your gear or buying some new rounds for your weapons, and enemies can still come up and attack you. Now, most of the time, they do a little bit of damage and you get kicked out of the interface, but sometimes you can get stuck in the interface, which, things like that happen. I think that the ability for that to happen really just adds to the fear factor, as it were, of the game. Of course, being able to listen to those audio logs while you're walking around can sometimes also be troublesome and get interrupted by either your crewmates talking to you or sounds of an enemy or something like that. But at least you're not having to stop and listen to them and interrupt your entire experience. That's a huge feature that was relatively new and not seen very much at the time, and it's one that's very much appreciated by me for sure. I'm not much of an aficionado on soundtracks or sound design or anything like that as far as video games go, but when I see something that's good, I do want to call it out. And I'll say that Jason Graves, the original composer for the series, primarily composed much of the music and the sounds, did a phenomenal job. There's suspense while also not the typical tropes of horror suspense that you hear. There's a lot of build-up while not letting you know exactly what's about to happen, and the way that the music dynamically works with the gameplay is phenomenal. But what I really wanted to highlight by bringing up the sound is that there are voices. And of course, for the majority of the game, and honestly, even a little bit at the end of the game, you still don't 100% know where these voices are coming from. And that adds to the spooky factor a lot, actually. You can be walking around and just hear voices speaking a few words to you at a time. This, of course, adds to the ambiance, the horror. It doesn't make it feel cheap, though. It makes it feel like the world around you is alive. And in fact, it is, but not in a great way, which I won't spoil, but just trust me, it's not a great way. I'm going to move on and talk about the characters a little bit, and I don't necessarily want to go into each character in depth, but what I want to talk about first, let's talk about Isaac. He's the star of the show, he's the main protagonist, he's the one doing all of the things you're doing in the game. You control Isaac from a third-person perspective, and Isaac doesn't speak. He walks around, he interacts with modules and kills necromorphs and listens to other people chat, but he's a silent protagonist. And I think that additional thing, he's not constantly talking to himself, he's not constantly talking to other people, he's not saying, how do I get out of here? Things like that you find in a lot of horror games and see in a lot of horror movies when somebody's alone. I think that actually amps it up and makes the game feel a little bit more close and a little bit more intimidating and a little bit more you're in your own head about things. And I don't know the original motivations for having Isaac be silent. I'm sure Glenn has talked about it somewhere in an interview, but I do know that it's something that I don't normally like in games. I don't like silent protagonists. I like to be a different person. I like to be a different character. I like to be in their body. And in this case, Isaac not talking kind of left me alone in my own head. And that really kind of freaked me out more than some of the other things in the game, quite frankly. While we're on the subject of other characters, I don't want to get too in-depth into each of them and talk about their motivations specifically, but we have the people who came with us over on the Kellyan, and that's Sergeant Hammond and Kendra. And these individuals are also part of the USG. Their motivations throughout the entire game we're questioning, we're not sure about them. And as the only other friendly faces we know, so to speak, I think that also amps up the horror dynamic. Now, again, this isn't a strictly just scary game out and out, but there's so many little things that add up psychologically to just make it a little bit intimidating, frankly. We don't know their motivations. We don't know exactly what they're doing. We know what they're supposed to be doing, and in fact, what they actually are doing to some extent. But just the fact that there's constant mistrust and there's constant unknown really adds to the psychological depths. It's not just a survival horror, it's a psychological horror to an extent as well. It doesn't fit right into the thriller camp, of course, but it certainly adds to the horror aspect of being in your own mind and not really knowing what's going through your own character's head. As for Nicole, Isaac's girlfriend, she's not my favorite. She doesn't have a lot of depth to her. And there are some narrative reasons for that, of course, but just the sense that you go to the Ishimura looking for Nicole, and Nicole doesn't really interact with Isaac very much, and Isaac doesn't really interact with her very much. That is one negative, I think, to the silent protagonist, but also I just feel like the character isn't terribly interesting. And I don't know that this is necessarily because of different plot devices and things like that. I think the writing and voice acting for Nicole just probably wasn't up to par in comparison with some of the other voice acting. And for me, that did diminish the experience a little bit, because I know if I were to go and see my wife on a faraway starship and she was stranded and I saw her for the first time, the interaction would be a little different. But with Nicole and Isaac, it's very cold and downplayed. And I'm not sure if that's a limitation of the abilities they had to do with the tech, or if that's just a narrative decision they made. But for me, that was one thing that actually drew me back out of that horror experience and not letting me really understand motivations and such. Of course, there are some other characters as well, but I want to talk about the main character, the Ishimura. Of course, we think of Isaac as the main character because he's the protagonist, but really the Ishimura, the ship, is alive, and it tells so much about everything you need to know. It not just through the audio logs and the voice logs, but through the design of the levels, through the design of the ship in general. Of course, you're seeing many spots on the Ishimura multiple times just because of the way the game works. You have to go certain places and come back and go through certain corridors multiple times. And you start to see that the Ishimura is alive and is breathing and is an entity of its own. And allowing the Ishimura to be not just a location or a set piece or something like that adds another depth to the narrative, in that it's not just the environment that is trying to cause harm to Isaac. It's the ship itself through the environment. Now, I've kind of mentioned some of my favorite things about the game as I've gone and some negatives as well, but briefly, I just wanted to touch on a few of the other things that didn't really do it for me. We've got enemy variety, and that's not just variety in the actual enemies themselves, although that is an issue as well. After the first few chapters, you don't really see any new types of enemies. That's good and bad, because on one hand, you know how to defeat them, you know what you're up against, but on the other side, I mean, come on. It's an alien game. Let's put some more aliens in it. But the other part about how it's a little bit repetitive is just that pretty much every enemy, every time you encounter them, every time you fight them, is going to make pretty much the same sounds over and over and over. And if you've got 4 or 5 of them in a room with you, making those same sounds over and over and over gets a little bit grating. And I understand the constraints of budgeting and these sounds maybe not being the most important thing that's needed. But in this game, your primary opposition all sounds the same, and it gets a little bit boring. Love to hear a menacing howl that I've never heard before, or encounter a new enemy type that I've never seen before and have to kill it in a different way than I've interacted before. The other issue that I have, and this again is an issue in 2023, this would not have been an issue in 2008, there's just so many loading screens. Every time you enter into a new room or into a cargo ship or anything like that, the game is very obviously loading. It's an old trick. Games that are modern still do it, don't get me wrong. But when I'm in an intense battle and then I get on an elevator and wait for 60 or 90 seconds for the next level to load, it does pull you out of the experience a little bit. Again, I understand, it's 2008. They're on the cutting edge of technology at this point with this game, but I will say it is one thing that kind of took away from the intended effect of the horror game for me. I'm also not a huge fan of jump scares. And this isn't because they're scary necessarily, although they are. I mean, you're going to jump with a jump scare most of the time. It's because I feel like there are so many other things going for Dead Space to make it scary, to make it intimidating, to make the world feel alive and terrifying, that the jump scares kind of cheapen that. When I round the corner and something pops out at me and tries to scare me, I might jump. I might even misclick a button or something like that. But for the most part, I want the fear to come from something else besides just something lashing out at me and jumping out at me. I understand it's a trope. It's in pretty much everything horror related that you can imagine. But for me, jump scares just don't land. So I know my thoughts and opinions have been a little scattered. I'm trying to talk about a game I played for the first time 15 years after it released. There's so much more to dive into. If I wanted to spoil the whole game and talk about everything from that perspective, I could do that as well and talk about motives and intentions and things like that. But for me, I just wanted to encourage other people who have never played Dead Space, or maybe you weren't gaming at the time, or you weren't able to get this game, or it's just something that wasn't interesting to you. I would encourage you to check it out. It's on Game Pass via EA Play for your monthly subscription cost. It's pretty cheap at retailers if you can find a used copy and play it that way. And if you want to buy a modern version of it on a modern console, it's pretty easy to do as well. So I am eager to jump into Dead Space 2 and 3. It's definitely something that I'm anticipating, looking forward to the remake and hoping that it is a faithful adaptation with some of those nice modern creature comforts we know will come to light, and we'll be able to see those in a new cool way. But I will say I'm not really sure that it needs the remake. The game, other than some of the things I mentioned that are products of its time, holds up remarkably well. Because of that, I would encourage anybody who has the means to do so, to go ahead and check it out. I would also encourage you, if you like the video, if you want to see more, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, ring the bell, whatever it is YouTubers say, do all that. Thanks, I'm Ben. Have a good day.
Then the truth